The wind came off the desert like a voice that had known 1,000 wars. It lifted the edges of banners into the sun and drove the sand into seams of armor. It carried the smell of sweat and horse and the faint bitter of smoke from distant fires. Men shaded their eyes and listened to that empty, great plain as if it might name their fate. Between two lines of colors, one small, white and trembling, the other vast and green like a moving forest, the world held its breath. If this story finds you, stay until the end. If it moves you, subscribe and like so more such remembrances may reach others. They called him the Leper King because the disease lay upon him like a secret that would not be kept. Baldwin IV was young enough for hope and old enough for a tired sorrow. The thinness of his face surprised those who had known him as a child. The mask he wore hid what honesty required and what courtesy demanded. His body betrayed him, hands that stung, a cough that came with sudden, cruel truth. But his eyes kept a clarity that could still order a line of men, or meet a rider in the press and be understood. When he rose from his litter to mount a horse, it was as if a bell tolled. Weakness and authority struck in the same note. Around him clustered the few who would not name surrender. Odo de Saint-A, a Templar of broad shoulders and a voice made for commands, moved like a quarry-hawk, always where the danger sharpened. Giovanni of Abellin wore his prudence like a cloak. He could speak to a lord and to a saddler without changing his temper. These men had argued, pleaded, and prayed in the councils of Jerusalem. They had seen the numbers, figures that read like a prophecy of doom. Some chroniclers would write it as 500 knights against 26,000. The math of the plain was cruel. It pressed at the mind and made strategy a kind of sacrament, a last recourse when mercy and might both seemed so little. The news had come on a morning of wavering heat. Scouts returning with hair wild and faces dark from the sun had told of an army like a tide rolling from the south and east, banners and standards innumerable, cavalry mounted, infantry spilling like a shadow. Saladin's name rode ahead of him. The Sultan moved as one man's will ordered many. His banners were green and black, his standards, like a forest, made shapes that swallowed light. He had encircled Ascalon, he had taken towns and touched the walls of the coast. The folk of Jerusalem spoke of his justice as much as of his sword, of a ruler who bound men together with law and fierce expectation rather than mere cruelty. To the east, his supply line stretched. To the north, rumors said his camp held men from every steppe and city, an army that expected to end a campaign and take the city by weight and will. Baldwin listened to the counting of men and to the council, then to his own breathing. He felt his pulse like a prayer answered harshly. His officers debated. Stay behind the walls, risk siege and famine. Sally forth, risk annihilation, but seize a moment. He had watched Jerusalem for years. Priests kept candles burning night and day in the chapel. Merchants kept their ledgers. Mothers kept their children close. He knew the ledger of the soul as well as any steward knew the ledger of coin. The choice was not merely tactical, it was a testament. Let them come upon us and starve, some voices said. Let the walls keep us safe, others urged. Odo leaned toward Baldwin with a weight of steel in his look. Sire, he said, you will not ask us to go meet such a host with such a handful. Baldwin's lips, a paler line under the mask, did not move at once. When he spoke, his voice surprised those who knew the cords had been weakened. If we do not go, he said, they will drink from our wells, take our wives, raise what fathers bled for. I will not be the prince who shrank at the sight of an enemy. He looked then at Giovanni and at the line of men whose hands tightened on reins and hilts. We will ride at dawn. It was not bravado, but a decision made out of a measured reading of fear and duty. Behind his courage lay a soft, secret prayer. "Lord, I am poor in strength. Make my smallness count." Perhaps the prayer was no more than a private habit, the kind a man makes to the sky so that his will may be steadied, but it hung in the air and steadied those near him. They rode from Ascalon before the sun stole fully from the east, the city walls shrinking into the heat behind them. The 500 knights and their retinues were a bright, defiant dot on the sand. Their horses moved with the quiet of those that have been bred for charge, their tack shining but simple. Priests rode among them, crosses uncovered, chanting brief litanies. The men listened and then let their minds drift to armor, to spear, to the smell of tar on saddles. The desert took them as if indifferent, but the wind, that ever-speaking thing, sent the banners snapping like an argument. White mantles, red crosses, the king's own pale standard set against the vast green of the enemy's approaching tide. It was during the march that the oddities of Saladin's column revealed themselves. There were choices in his deployment. His host stretched in length, his baggage moved slow beneath the care of many, and here and there detachments rode laxly as if arrogant to the point of negligence. Those were the glimpses that men like Giovanni read as openings. "He has spread himself thin," Giovanni murmured to Baldwin one night by a low fire. "Beasts need water, men must sleep. We will not meet his whole weight if we strike a seam." Odo spat into the sand. "Seams are gifts from God or from folly," he said. "Not unkindly. We will take what comes." Scouts ran ahead and back, and rumor braided with fact. One evening, a rider came with the salt of sweat shining on his brow, and spoke of a vanguard resting on a ridge, its flank less guarded than the chronicles of a hasty conqueror might suggest. The reading of terrain and hour became a sort of prayer among them. Watch, wait, and then move with the certainty of those who trust less to numbers and more to movement. Saladin kept counsel in his tent with a stillness that disguised the storm. He had every right to be proud. He had brought together men from the countryside and from courts. He had bound them with the stern law of victory and disciplined them with the promise of reward. A commander bears the world like a map folded into his hands. He must fold it cleverly, or ruin will follow. His lieutenants argued for encirclement and for immediate siege, for capturing the wells and cutting the small force like shears. Yet his scouts reported the march of the Christians, a small fire beating toward him like a stubborn moth. From the Sultan's side, there were no easy dismissals of Baldwin as a mere boy with a mask. He knew, like men who had wrestled with Europe's many kings, that the measure of a foe lay sometimes in the unexpected. "They come," one Amir said, "and they have a king who will not be carved to look small." Saladin's eyes, dark and steady as a night tide, watched the line on the plain and thought of consequences. He believed in the rightness of his cause and in the accuracy of his instruments. Yet there is a humility in thinking to win and then finding an opponent who does not shrink. That humility did not soften him, but made him steel his plans against slippage. The morning the three lines confronted one another, the sun sat like a god to judge. The small band of crusaders moved in disciplined accord, their lances bright, their horses stamping. Baldwin sat a little higher than many expected, the reins wrapped with a careful hand who understood trembling. He wore a helm that bore a cross, and when it lifted briefly, his eyes read the field as if reading scripture. Around him, the knights murmured words of courage and prayed in quick, honest phrases. "Almighty, stand with us," an old knight whispered before placing hand to pommel. Baldwin's own prayer was shorter, less demonstrative, but when he touched the cross at his breast, it seemed to those watching that his chest straightened as if some invisible weight had been set upon his shoulders and then supported. They struck first with a feint, a line of spears that met some of Saladin's forward guard and then pulled away, drawing a portion of the vast host into a shallow chase. Then, like the snapping of a bow, the leap came. Baldwin ordered the charge, and the 500 became a wall of white and steel that broke from the dune, their hooves striking the sand as a single drum. The effect was not merely physical, but moral. Men expected the small force to crumble in the face of the forest of opponents, but the sight of such resolve altered fears. For those who saw it, the heart is sometimes persuaded by courage as much as by reason. The clash was a melee of sound, shouts stripped raw, the rattle of mail, horses' cries, the dull thud of bodies meeting bodies. Sand sprang up in a cloud, turning morning into an instant twilight, and the banners of both sides became shapes among shapes. Baldwin's men pressed with a disciplined fury, lances finding gaps in unready lines. Swords flashed where the green had been thick. Odo roared like a man who had been forged by noise. He threw himself into the press and cut a path where fear had been thickest. Giovanni moved from flank to flank, a steady balm of counsel and a hand that directed where needed. There were moments that mark the turning of histories in a single detail. A standard caught on a spear, a trumpeter fallen but his horn still sending a tremulous note, a horse rearing and then plunging toward a gap in the enemy. Saladin's lines, for all their numbers, were not a single mind. They were a vast collection of wills. When a wedge opened and a swift, narrow charge found its way to the Sultan's flank, rumor would later call that wedge providence or luck. Men in armor have other names for such things: time, place, a command obeyed at the right instant. From Saladin's camp came the sound of recoil. His banner-bearers sought to bind gaps and to make walls of men where walls had been broken. Emirs shouted, and men streamed to close holes as if mending a torn sail. Saladin himself rode to the place where the fighting gained the weight of a crisis. He moved like a man whose mind is a blade, quick, sharp, and precise. His presence steadied his men and forced the assailants to meet a new coordination of strength. For a heartbeat it seemed equal, tide against tide, each man giving what his armor would allow. Then something else happened, an exhaustion of the larger host that no tally had predicted. The long line of Saladin's army had been strung thin by supply and by overconfidence. Some detachments came late, others were muffled in the rear by their own numbers. Baldwin's charge, quick and concentrated, did not need to hold all field. It needed to break a seam and to force the enemy to attend to that wound. As the day lengthened, the Sultan found himself fighting local collapses rather than a single crushing blow. Here and there the green faltered. Horses tired, men who had never before seen such drive found their courage fraying. Amid the smoke and dust, the king's figure rose and fell like a signal. Baldwin rode where he must, felt the tremor of his hands and the ache of his limbs, and kept the order. Odo, next to him, felt a surge of respect that bordered on awe and anger. How could fate be so cruel to give such a man this burden? Giovanni, wiping sand from his beard, saw young knights rally where despair had held. It is one thing to read about courage, it is another to see it in the face of a man whose own body seemed to betray him at every breath. Saladin watched the fractures appear and made the choice leaders make: bind what must be bound, and where the line thinned, feed men in to hold ground. He ordered reliefs and sent cavalry where needed, but the momentum had slipped like water through a broken dam. The Sultan felt the slow, terrible recognition that even an army of 26,000 may falter when hit in the right seam by a will that will not yield. He would later tell his lieutenants, firmly, with no bitterness, that surprise and mischance had conspired against him. Yet in the first falling away, his face kept the dignity of a commander who would not flinch from the measure of his responsibility. The charge kept cutting. The plain took the sound of steel on steel and the low chanting of men whose thought had turned to single points: strap, press, breathe. Horses' sides were wet with sweat,
Sand clung to straps and to blood alike, painting both with the same indifferent dust. Men fell and were borne away by comrades. Priests moved through the press like shadows, offering quick absolutions, hands laid on shoulders, eyes raised to a sky that did not answer in any clear voice. Then the momentum snapped. Where once the green had seemed like an unbreakable wall, there became holes and ragged retreat. Saladin's banners wavered and then pulled back, and the vast numbers of his host turned from pursuit to withdrawal in places where they had expected victory. The sight of that vast retreat, men turning their horses away and the standards folding like cut sails, was the point where the improbable became a tale that would be told by those who survived. In the very heart of the tumult, Baldwin felt a strange stillness, as if a chord inside him had been twanged and then released. He knew the cost even in the surge of triumph. His eyes caught a child's face among the baggage, a nun praying with a cracked voice, a standard-bearer whose arm had been broken but who still clung to the cloth. Victory came with its weight, a field of the fallen, a city whose joy would be tempered by the lists of the dead. He dismounted at a small knoll and bowed his head for a whisper of thanks that was more a confession than a cry. "Lord," he breathed, and the words were less a claiming of credit than a recognition of a hand felt in the dark. From across the plain, Saladin watched his troops pull back, and felt the edge of a wound. He ordered no slaughter of the routed beyond pursuit where advantage could be had. He kept the restraint of a man who knew that rage can yield too great a cost. As his horse turned, he fixed his gaze on the small king who had led this blow, masked and thin, upright in the saddle like a reed that had not been felled. The Sultan felt, in that look, something akin to respect. He would later swear to return, not merely as the promise of a commander, but as the vow of a man who had been taught by humility. This boy, stricken and masked, had broken his tide.
The horns fell silent, and the wind took up the scraps of banners like a thief gathering stories. Men shouted, and then were quiet, as if speech was exhausted. The plain lay mottled with the signs of combat, shattered lances, a horse left mid-gleam, a shield with a cross half buried in sand. Priests and surgeons moved among the living and the dying with the same grim tenderness, binding wounds, praising God, and carrying the names of the fallen into a memory that would be tender and terrible. Baldwin's body trembled in a different way now, a fatigue that was not merely of limb, but of something deeper. He had won an impossible day, but the price would be counted in the months that followed, in coughs that would not leave, in the slow narrowing of breath. He felt the ache and let it be. His rejoicing was humble, tempered by the shade of sorrow that never left a field where men had died. When night came, Jerusalem would open its gates to those who returned, and the city would sing in cautious, tearful voice. But in the hush after the thunder, Baldwin sat with Giovanni and Odo beside a low brazier and spoke of things beyond strategy, of mercy, of what a ruler owes to both the living and the dead. He had been a king who bore disease like an accusation. Now he bore victory like a testament and a warning. Across the valley, Saladin gathered his commanders and measured what had been lost and what yet could be rebuilt. He would not boast of failure, but he would not hide it either. His vow to return sat in his throat like a stone, promised, yes, but measured by patience and recalculation. In some accounts, he would later send envoys to the Christian king, not with threats alone, but with a strange mixture of respect and strategy. The night folded over both camps like a benediction that knew nothing of sides. Men lit candles, tended wounds, and whispered prayers. The desert wind, steady, unblinking, moved through the ranks and lifted the dust that had been stirred to make a different future. For Baldwin, the victory would be a great act of providence,
and a moment that lit hope in a city threatened and trembling. For Saladin, it would be a lesson that hardened resolve rather than broke it. Yet the hour was not done. The plain warmed and cooled as men slept and watched, and the knowledge of what had been won did not erase the tally of loss. Flags still flew over the city, and mothers still traced the names of sons in the dust. The king who had led the charge felt the slow press of his own mortality, and with it, the pressing responsibility to bind the wounds of a people before his own faded. In the east, a faint light promised the next day, more decisions, more tending, and the long reckoning that follows any battle. No chronicle could yet claim its last word. History was only beginning to speak of that day in sentences that would become legend. Dawn came slow and steady, a light like pale linen laid over the bones of the field.
Men rose with the stiffness of the dead. Many moved because duty pulled them, others because sorrow would not let them lie idle. Baldwin walked among them with a cloak slung about his shoulders, though the chill was not merely of the air. He kept to the edges where the surgeons worked, where the litters were laid, and the moaning had the cadence of confession. He stopped where a young squire lay with his eyes half open, the dust still in his hair, a bandage at his side. The squire tried to smile when he saw the king, and the smile was brave and small. Baldwin bent and took the hand, felt the faint warmth, and said a few words that were more like a benediction than counsel. A priest crossed himself and spoke in a low voice. The squire's breath steadied and then faltered, and Baldwin's hand remained until the priest had finished. He would send a messenger that hour to the family named upon the squire's braid, to ensure bread and coin and remembrance. Such things cost but little and meant a great deal. Giovanni and Odo kept close. Giovanni counted stores and men like a farmer counts seed after a hard season. Odo, who had the steadier eye for law and mercy, lingered where the wounded complained of cold or of names unspoken. "We must bury them," Giovanni said at last. "Not only the nobles, but the common men. Give them ground and a prayer. The women at the gates will need the list. We cannot let names be forgotten." Baldwin nodded. To forget was to wound twice. The priests began, by the king's order, the roll of the dead. A white cloth was spread upon the ground, and each name was spoken aloud, a voice for a life. Mothers pressed forward with notes and rough tokens, threads, a scrap of a tunic, a coin, things that would anchor memory when the world turned again. The city bells in Jerusalem answered faintly, and the sound stitched itself into the morning like a seam. Baldwin listened as the names came, and when the roll reached the men of his household, his voice broke and then grew firm. He pronounced the prayers with the measured cadence a ruler needs when the heart trembles. He issued commands that could not wait. Men able to ride were to bring wood and canvas for shelter, to clear wells and to set guards at the gates lest disorder rise from hunger. Others were to collect the wounded and bring them into the city where the surgeons and the sisters of mercy could tend them better. He forbade summary punishments of prisoners taken in the rout. Mercy, he said, was not a weakness but a standard of rule. Let them be measured by law, he told Odo, and by our hands, not by the unbridled sword. Odo bowed and dispatched men to see that the orders were carried. When he could spare a moment from the work that made kings into shepherds, Baldwin withdrew to the small tent he kept near the knoll. Giovanni followed, and remained without complaint at the flap, a protector and a witness. Baldwin sat and looked at the face of the man who had been, before all this, a boy who had worn a crown like an armor that sometimes clanged. He felt the cough gather, a tightening like a hand at the throat, and he did not deny it now. He had learned to read his body the way a captain reads the weather, signs and storms. He thought of the months to come. He thought of his people who would lean on him for more than arms or strategy. A messenger from Saladin arrived before the second hour, bearing a banner not of threat but of words. The envoy dismounted and offered, by the custom observed between commanders who had met in battle and learned some measure of each other, a parchment sealed with a simple knot. Baldwin broke the seal with a trembling hand and read. The letter spoke first of courage observed and losses counted. It spoke then, with a tone that neither lied nor bowed, of the hope that blood need not be the only ledger between them. Saladin proposed envoys to speak of ransoms, of the wounded, and of prisoners taken. He offered respect for the dead and care for the living as measure enough to begin a negotiation. Baldwin read once, then twice. His mind turned the letter as a smith turns metal to see its grain. He answered through Giovanni that he would receive envoys at the midday shelter, and that the wounded of both sides would have the surgeons and the sisters tended without hindrance. There is a dignity, he said to Giovanni, even in parleys begun with ruin. We will not let hate make law here. Giovanni made a note and bowed. The envoys came beneath a white canopy, and for a space the air was kept simple by the weight of words exchanged between men no longer strangers, yet not friends. They spoke of bodies and goods, of lists and of mercy. Saladin's men were careful and grave, Baldwin's were measured and firm. There was heat enough between them to char, but both commanders tempered talk with propriety. The first day would be for lists and for promises written and sealed. The fuller accounting of ransoms and vows could wait until the wounded were tended. Each side carried away a sense that the other had shown restraint worth its weight. As the afternoon wore, Baldwin made his slow rounds into the city. He passed through the market where the stalls had been cleared in deference to the dead and the living in need. Women with red-rimmed eyes sold bread at no more than a coin. Fathers stood and stared as if the sight of life might be sharper than it had been. A woman accosted the king then, and he stopped. She held a strip of leather and a ring and said quietly, "My son, he took this. He did not return." Baldwin took the ring in his palm and saw the crude mark where the boy had struck his name. He felt the hollow of it, like an echo. He asked her to sit, and she did, as though seated by a hearth. He spoke with her as a man who had lost and known loss might, of care for the family, of coin to be sent, of a place in the roll of remembrance. He did not fumble with platitudes. He confessed that words were poor tools for such a wound, but that his hands would see to the work. The woman's face softened, and then hardened again. Mercy is sometimes a thread pulled taut with grief. She blessed the king, and he, in turn, bowed his head. Night came again, but it was a night lined with work. The surgeons and the sisters labored until the lamps guttered. Men wrapped the dead and marked them with the names that would be carved into memory. Baldwin sat near a brazier and listened to the murmur of counsel. He and Giovanni discussed fortifications, what stones should be raised, which gates must be shored. Odo read aloud the lists of names to be sent to convents for prayers. No rejoicing now, only the sober mechanics of preserving what remained. Far to the south, on a rise where the wind kept the banners from settling, Saladin stood with the stars like witnesses above him. He allowed himself a single hour of solitude, feeling the ache of the day press into him. He thought of the boy-king who had pierced his tide, and of the humility that such a thing instilled. He would not forget, nor would he gloat. Plans would be made, and patience would temper vengeance into strategy. He ordered the graves of his own to be tended as the Christians had tended theirs. Respect must walk beside rivalry if the world was to keep its shape. For Baldwin, the victory had the weight of a sacrament laid upon it, blessings wrapped tight with sorrow. He slept in the tent, but not as one untroubled. His cough whispered in the dark like a second companion.
In the morning he would speak to the council about rebuilding, about ransoms, about peace, and about the small mercies that stitch a bleeding city back to life. He would do all of this with hands that had bled and a chest that remembered how to count breaths as one counts coin, carefully, with care. So the days that followed would be given to mending, of men, of walls, and of accords. The story of the plain had been written in blood and prayer. Its next lines would be penned in ledger and in law, in graves and in marriages, in promises kept and in vows deferred. Neither king had finished learning from that day, and the desert wind that traveled between their tents carried both the scent of conquest and the promise of further reckonings. For now, both houses lived by the same fragile law, to bind the wounds they had made before the future asked too much of them. They set about the work as if it were a liturgy, precise, hushed, obedient to rites that mended both stone and spirit. Men carted fallen beams from houses whose roofs had caved like chests. Women spread out linens to dry over low walls. Children, who had yet to learn the steadiness of sorrow, played at hauling pebbles, as if they rewove a world with tiny hands. Baldwin moved among them with the air of one who did not pretend his touch could heal all things. He offered what he could, grain, shelter, a word, and let the rest be borne by those whose task it was to bear. At dawn he convened the council beneath the great vault of the hall, where the tapestries were smudged with smoke, and the map on the table bore new scratches where the edge of war had cut. Giovanni sat with his pen ready, his face pared thin by the long days. Odo, who had slept little, read from a parchment by the light of a single lamp, and let each name fall like a stone into the quiet. "These are the men taken in the plain," he said. "These are the townsfolk carried away from the market. These are the boys." The room contracted around the listing. Even the scribes wrote with fingers that trembled. Baldwin listened without haste. He weighed the lists as a man might weigh coins, not to reckon value, but to reckon duty. There were calls for ransom, both in silver and in pledges of safe passage. There were entreaties for priests to be allowed to tend to captives. There were names that would never come back, because fever and blade had spoken where mercy could not reach. "We will tend the living," Baldwin said at last. "We will honor the dead, and we will name those who are missing so that the world remembers them as more than absence." His cough, low and private, caught once in the silence. A man bent forward in the council seat, reached for him, and put down a cup of wine unasked. Giovanni argued for a ledger to be kept open, particulars of ransoms, oaths sworn with witnesses, jewelry and harness to be sealed until exchange. "It must be done in plain sight," he said. "Man must not think there is profit in this sorrow." Baldwin nodded. "Let it be as you say. The accounts will not be instruments of policy only, they will be monuments to what we would not have allowed to happen." He traced the edge of a paper with a fingertip and then turned to Odo. "See that prayers are offered for those with no family," he said, "and let the convents set watch over the names. If their hands are the last to touch the poor, then let them be the ones to remember." Outside, the work of mercy took shape in ways that could not be set in ink. The sisters moved through the wards with steady palms, dressing flesh-stung wounds, binding eyes, humoring the fevered. A surgeon from the east who had ridden in with Saladin's retinue treated a man whose arm had been shattered by a spear. The surgeon and the sister argued over the propriety of an operation, and then went about it side by side. What the surgeon stitched, the people stitched too. Houses patched, wells cleaned, a wall raised where a breach had been. A man who had 3 sons and had lost 2 of them bent over the new graves, and with a stone he wrote the names himself, imperfect but precise, fingers clumsy with weeping and workmanship both. Far on the plain where the tents of Saladin still smoked from the bivouac fires, the emir took counsel of his own. His lieutenants came and went, men chosen for steadiness rather than for loud counsel. They spoke of prisoners and of the futures that might be bought by the returns of the living. Saladin listened more than he spoke. He ordered that all who had been taken from the Christian quarters be allowed succor. He instructed his men to separate the raiders from those who had acted under strict command. "We do not want hatred to plant deeper roots," he told them. "Let there be justice, but let it be tempered." An envoy from Baldwin arrived at Saladin's tent bearing a sealed clay token and a simple request: a list of those in custody and the terms by which they might be had. The envoy was received without fanfare, given bread and wine, and returned with an answer that proposed exchanges by names and by number, stipulating that certain nobles be kept until oaths were sworn. The terms were careful, as if both sides feared the cheapness of a promise. When the envoys broke their bread and spoke, there was less heat than formality. Each side measured the other's grief, as if in search of a shared scale. It was in the small hours of one night, when the lamps were guttering and the wind had dropped into an uneasy stillness, that Baldwin found Giovanni alone by the brazier. Giovanni had a slate and charcoal. He had been making lists anew, and his hands smudged the dark dust of ink and thought. He looked older in the wavering light. "You asked for pledges," he said. "You asked for law to bind those pledges. Do you trust written oaths will hold where swords have failed?" Baldwin drew his cloak tighter and looked at the coals. "I do not trust them," he said frankly. "But it is better to make a man swear than to leave him without the shape of an answer. The oath is not a shield, never has been, but it is a way to make a man see himself reflected in the cost we ask him to bear." He cleared his throat. "And perhaps, Giovanni, even paper will be heavier when a man thinks of names it bears." Giovanni smiled, small and dry. "Then we will write heavy lines." He tapped the slate. "We will make witnesses. We will set men to watch over the exchanges so that no one may claim that promises were taken in jest." He hesitated, then said, "There are mothers who came to me today. They wanted to know if their boys were still brothers in the sight of God. They ask for a word of hope." Baldwin did not offer what he did not have. "Tell them their sons are not forgotten," he said. "Arrange prayers, give them receipts of remembrance." He reached out and laid his hand on Giovanni's, an unusual intimacy from a king, but the gesture was simple, and Giovanni took it as the answer it was: a king's small, costly kinship.
News came then of an exchange arranged to take place at a ruined chapel midway between the lines, where the bell lay toppled and grass had begun to reclaim the stone. The two sides met with cautious truce, and with the bars and ledgers spread upon a pew. Men were counted, lances checked, faces matched to names. When the first of the captives walked free, the air seemed to cleave. Some came home to arms that had not yet learned whether to be soft or bitter. Others returned to their fathers' houses and found place empty or full of others' grief. One young man, gaunt and soot-streaked, fell to his knees and kissed the hand of the woman who had once held his wayward sleeve. She did not rise to embrace him at once. She only put her palm upon his head and then let him clamber up into her arms like a boy. And that small forgiveness was holy in its way. Saladin watched from his litter as the columns moved back towards the plain. He turned the sight into counsel for his commanders, about discipline, about the need to keep the high line of honor even in advantage. For Baldwin, the sight of faces returned would be a medicine and a reminder that triumph must be converted into governance, and that every mercy bought with coin should be sustained by law and kindness. The days lengthened, and with them the work of repair. A mason set the cornerstone of a gate, his hammer ringing a measured tone across the square. The bell in the ruined chapel hung now as a mute witness until it could be hauled, rung, and made to speak again. In the market, a stall reopened with a banner stitched in sober colors. A child sold trinkets he had carved from olive wood, and his coins went to a mother whose grief had only been softened. Yet, beneath the visible mending, there were other stitches to be made, of trust,
of restraint, of compacts that both sides feared might unravel. Baldwin's cough stayed with him like a second shadow. There were nights when he would trace the outline of a name with a finger and then look up at the stars as if measuring how far their mercy might reach. Saladin, too, kept watches of his own, and in those hours he wrote little orders and no boasts, fearing that triumph might invite ruin if fed by pride. The wind that crossed the plain carried seeds of future reckonings, it is true. Old enmities do not die merely because graves are tended. But for a time the world bent to the slower craft of mending. Men and women went about rebuilding with hands that had learned what to hold and what to let fall. And when at last the sun fell one evening and the tents shadowed the plain, Baldwin stood upon a low wall where he could see both the city he had defended and the tents beyond its site. And he thought of the ledger Giovanni had kept and the names Odo had read aloud. He thought of the woman in the market and of the boy who had kissed his mother's hand. He let his hand rest on the stone and felt, under the hardness, the faint warmth of a day that had not been wasted.
A new day would come with its own account to be paid. For now, the task was to bind the seams and to keep the promises already made. For promises are lighter than swords, but, if kept, heavier than victory. The plain slept beneath a slow, forgiving sky. Its scars remained visible, but so did the lines of labor that would, over seasons, turn those scars into memory rather than definition. In the quiet between the tents and the city, both kings kept watch in their different ways, one with ledger, one with counsel, and neither allowed himself the ease of surety. The world, having been remade by a day of blood, would be remade again in the quieter, harder hours of tending.